The United States of America is in grave danger, and it's about to take Europe down with it. If we don't change direction, we're in big trouble. All right, folks, let's get into this one. This is an unbelievable set of stories that we're going to go over. And the more I look at this, the more I begin to reflect upon passages like Daniel chapter 7 and really consider and contemplate what will be this sort of 10 kingdom confederation that will overtake the world and become, in essence, what will be a one world government under the Antichrist. All these stories that we're talking about are moving us in that general direction. And that's why I'm going over them. I want you to keep in mind where we're going with this and why it is such a dangerous spot. Now, we know it's a dangerous spot, not only because of the implications that it has for full-scale war and the lack of preparedness that we have and Europe has, for that matter, to be able to fight that war, but it also speaks volumes of the kind of grave danger that we're in because of what will become the inconsequentiality of not only our nation, but all the other nations that choose to function individually or even unilaterally, for that matter, because eventually what will happen is we will begin to see these confederations being built. And I want everybody to understand that Russia is going to be, in essence, the only superpower that will stand, especially if we read and believe what the book of Ezekiel tells us and know what's going to take place. As a matter of fact, we know that when Russia actually attacks Israel, Israel won't be able to defend itself, but God will defend Israel. And that's why we know Russia will be unsuccessful, but that will be the only time that, in essence, they're going to be unsuccessful. So let's get into some of these stories because they are serious and they're very important. And we really do need to pay very special attention to what's being said in these stories. And believe it or not, these stories are actually coming out of Politico. But even then, a lot of the information that's being given here are serious and they are worth being looked at. Now, the title of this story is Biden secretly gave Ukraine permission to strike inside Russia with U.S. weapons. Folks, that's true. It should not come to a surprise to anybody. We kind of had a feeling that this was already going on, but this story breaking as of a few days ago really is critical to look at because of what obvious implications may lie in what is about to happen and the effects of what may take place as a result of such an insane decision. And again, this also goes back to what we talked about when we did Countdown to Eternity this week. We talked about the fact that if you are not walking with God, you're not sober-minded. And if you're not sober-minded, you're going to be making a series of dramatically inebriated decisions that will lead to the destruction of your nation and the people around you. So let's read this article. It says, the Biden administration has quietly given Ukraine permission to strike inside Russia solely near the area of Kharkiv using U.S.-provided weapons. By the way, this comes from 3 U.S. officials who are very familiar with the move. And it's interesting to think about this sort of reversal that's beginning to take place amongst what's happening with respect to Ukraine and the policy that's existed there. Look at the quote here. It says, the president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use U.S. weapons for counter-fire purposes in Kharkiv so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces, hitting them or preparing to hit them. This is a U.S. official who says this. And then the quote goes on to say that Russia or airstrikes inside Russia has not changed as it relates to the United States disallowing it. Well, that's impossible. You can't say that the United States of America is still not allowing airstrikes inside Russia to take place while actually allowing this to take place. It doesn't make any kind of sense. The article goes on to say Ukraine asked the U.S. to make this policy change only after Russia's offensive in Kharkiv began this month, the official added. All the people were granted anonymity to discuss internal decisions that haven't been announced. In the last few days, the U.S. made the decision to allow Ukraine flexibility, is what they would call it, quote, flexibility, to defend itself from attacks on the border near Kharkiv, the second U.S. official said. I want you to look at the Secretary of State who actually makes a statement in relationship to this. Let me play this video because this is very striking. Watch this.
Over the past few weeks, Ukraine came to us and asked for the authorization to use weapons that we're providing to defend against this aggression, including against Russian forces that are massing on the Russian side of the border and then attacking into Ukraine. That went right to the president and, as you've heard, he's approved the use of our weapons for that purpose.
It's amazing. I want you to understand what that means when it says he's approved for the use of those weapons for that purpose. That basically means that they are, in essence, allowing Ukraine to, in the name of preemptive defense, literally strike any targets inside the Russian border, which will, of course, create, in effect, what we understand and know to be one of the most insane wars that will break out on a much larger scale and will do immense damage, not only to our country, but to all of the European nations around. Let me read what the rest of the article says, or another portion of this article. Another portion of this article says, it's a stunning shift the administration initially said would escalate the war by more directly involving the U.S. in the fight. But worsening conditions for Ukraine on the battlefield, namely Russia's advances and improved position in Kharkiv, led the president to change his mind. Okay, you have to understand something. You have to understand, and we're going to talk about this next week. I'm actually going to show you a really incredible interview with Tucker Carlson that I provided a lot of commentary on. We pushed Russia into this. And the more and more and more they began to engage Ukraine, we encouraged the fight to go on because we took off the table any possibility for peace talks. As a matter of fact, the president of the United States just recently again walked away from even the possibility of attending some kind of peace summit for Ukraine. They do not want peace. They want war because these are neocons in the United States of America that simply want to put their position in Russia and around Russia and in Ukraine and around Ukraine so that they can, in essence, fight or engage in a proxy war with Russia at the expense of Ukrainian lives. That's what we're seeing here. But I can tell you this right now, folks, it's not going to work. They grossly underestimate the position of Russia. And that'll be the next article that we get into here. Look what it goes on to say. It says the Biden administration hinted that a decision had either been secretly made or foretelling in recent days. And on Wednesday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who supports a restriction lift, became the first U.S. official to publicly hint that Biden may shift course and allow such strikes, telling reporters that U.S. policy toward Ukraine would evolve as needed. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby later did not rule out a potential change. John Kirby, it's just what a mess. Folks, I'm telling you right now, it is getting bad, and we are getting to the point as the United States of America where we are about to wake up the largest sleeping giant that is in the Eurasia region. It's not going to be good, and the ramifications of what we do are going to be so significant with respect to the future degradation of the United States and the current annihilation of Ukraine that it will be beyond the capacity of so many to be able to fathom or understand. And it's getting very desperate in the region right now. And this is something that we could avoid. Russia continues to show sign after sign after sign after sign after sign that they're only doing what they're doing because they're being forced into doing it. And if they could find some type of resolve to make peace, they will back down from doing it. Putin has been very clear about this. His understanding of the history and the matters at hand, I think, have been reasonable. And I'm not defending him, but what I am saying is that I will not defend the position of the United States in what they did, because what they did was completely unacceptable. And understand that when you choose to push and push and push and prod and lie and cheat and steal from the leader of the Russian Federation and the leaders prior to him, you cannot be surprised when the angry bear attacks back. It's really, really simple. They were put in a very, very difficult situation. So look at this article. This article says Russia warns U.S. of fatal consequences over miscalculations in Ukraine. This is a pretty powerful thing. The quote here says, they underestimate the seriousness of the rebuff they may receive. This is the Russian minister who's saying this. Let's read the article. It says the Kremlin on Monday said the U.S. could face fatal consequences if it ignores Moscow's warnings that Ukraine should not use weapons provided by Washington to attack Russia. The quote goes on to say this. It says, I would like to warn American leaders against miscalculations that could have fatal consequences, said Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov. By the way, this comes out of the Russian state news agency. And the quote goes on to say, for unknown reasons, they underestimate the seriousness of the rebuff they may receive. And I think that that's a fair statement coming out of Moscow. I understand the idea that some people do not like what happened with Putin, but I also don't like what forced Putin to do what Putin actually did. And now we're actually seeking to make it worse now that Ukraine is taking a massive pummeling. They're getting their literal rears kicked in the war. We're going to now re-inject Ukraine with some sort of false hope or pretension that they're going to be able to win. Yet the problem with that is it's going to pick a bigger war. And that war is going to be with the United States of America and Europe, and Russia is not going to lose this war. Look what it goes on to say. It says last week, the Biden administration quietly gave Ukraine permission to use some U.S.-provided weapons to strike military targets in Russia territory. Some European governments recently gave similar positions. By the way, they're talking about the French giving permission, especially with respect to the defense of Kiev, which is a huge mistake. I believe that it was done by the pressuring hand of the United States of America. I believe most of Europe wants nothing to do with any of it, especially from within NATO, but I think they're being forced to do it based on the position that the United States of America is taking. That's what I believe is happening here. The article goes on to say Kiev has been calling for extra flexibility with the use of Western weapons as Russian President Vladimir Putin's forces push into the Kharkiv region of Ukraine. U.S. President Joe Biden recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use U.S. weapons for counterfire purposes in Kharkiv so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces, hitting them or preparing to hit them, a U.S. official told Politico, adding that the policy of allowing long-range strikes against Russia has not been changed. But it will change, folks. I promise you it will. The article goes on to say, Putin last week warned the West against allowing its weapons to be used by Ukraine to strike Russia. And this is the quote, constant escalation can lead to serious consequences, Putin said on May 29th. And he goes on to say this, if these serious consequences occur in Europe, how will the United States behave, bearing in mind our parity in the field of strategic weapons? And look, Putin is right about that. We're not going to be able to defeat the idea that Russia or defeat the power of Russia to be able to function strategically with the use of these types of weapons. We're not going to do that because we're not in a position to do that. We don't have enough trained people to do it. And the technology, although we have some of this technology, we're very behind in its deployment and use. A great example of this is we have a whole bunch of F-35s that are not battle ready. We have a whole bunch of vessels that were made for the United States Navy that aren't even close to ready. We have a lot of stuff that's in bad order. We have things that are not even usable, but we're putting out just to simply look strong, even though we don't have the capacity to use these things, folks. That's the situation that we're in. Look what it goes on to say. It says, Ryabkov referred the U.S. administration to Putin's, quote, very significant warning, adding that, quote, it must be taken with the utmost seriousness. And U.S. officials should, quote, spend some time studying what was said in detail. And folks, this is not a warning that's designed to put on a poker face and bluff and get them to react a different way or to move in a different function. The idea behind this is to simply warn them of what will inevitably come. There were warnings like this that were issued before Russia went into Ukraine. There were warnings like this that were issued when Ukraine kept fighting back, fully understanding and knowing that it could do nothing about the situation that was going on. And it continues to be the warnings that are disregarded by the United States of America, because when you look at the comments of political leaders like, for example, Mitt Romney, who says this is a great deal. It's a great bargain. That's what Mitt Romney thinks about this war. He says, we get to fight a war in essence with Russia without American lives. Problem is, it will eventually involve American lives, and a human life is a human life. We don't use people's lives as puppets to be able to accomplish some purpose that is, of course, especially nefarious. This kind of stuff is wicked. This kind of stuff is dark. It's demonic, and it's not anything that should surprise us. Folks, this is the type of thing that we continue to see evidence of that shows us we're moving in this direction that we read about in the last days. And we know, folks, where it's going. We know where it's going to end up, and we've got to keep our heads up to be looking at these things. The bottom line is this. If you understand what the Bible says about the last days, then you will look at what we're doing right now in Russia, and you will literally beg that it not be done. because we know what the end game is going to be. And if we know what the end game is going to be, it should be able to mold and shape what our foreign policy is to be able to understand what's happening. What I see is this, folks. I see that Russia is being prepped by God to become the nation that it will become when it leads a conglomerate of nations, according to Ezekiel 38, against Israel, okay? I know that that's happening. He's also preparing all of Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, all of Europe, Asia, and all the other continents to prepare for the type of maneuvering geopolitically that's going to have to take place in order for these things to be ready or set up for all of the items that we know are going to be taking place within God's biblical prophetic timeline. So we're seeing this happen. We're looking at Israel in the position that it's in. We're understanding what the Bible tells us concerning what will be a 10-kingdom confederation or a 10-nation confederation that will, I believe, will involve, a conglomerate of nations that come together as one nation, and all these one nations come together as a whole super nation or a global nation. That's what we're going to see. We are going to see these 10 kingdoms give their power to the final Antichrist, who will then begin to bring some semblance of peace until, of course, he comes in with the picture of total totalitarianism and does what the rider of the white horse actually does and what we read about in Revelation 13. Folks, these things are inevitable. We're seeing so much of this begin to form. We're seeing it shape. I'm not saying that things are going to happen tomorrow or this is, Revelation chapter. I think we're going to be Revelation chapter 6. I think we're going to be raptured before that time. But I will tell you, it looks like we're watching what appears to be the geopolitical infrastructure changing in order to create this theater of war that we read about in the Bible. We're seeing it happening. We should pay attention to it, understand for what it is, and recognize we're running out of time. More than effort, we have to start making our hearts right with the Lord. We've got to start walking with him. We've got to start looking to him. We've got to start seeking him for direction. We're running out of time, folks. Look to the Lord. Seek him. Go to his word. God bless you.